Time passed. Afternoon. A great many performers and people noisily gathered inside the theater to prepare for the evening performance. Lyceum Theatre, a theatre exclusively for actors upon whom the spotlight of London's theatrical world shone. The theatre would not allow any imperfection in its performances. All of the costumes and props they used were genuine. There were no dresses or decorations or synthetics. Creating a world through plays. That was the Lyceum Theatre's tagline, and it was a source of pride. There was a very famous story about them once hiring one of the palace's own master architects to construct their stage. Even though their setting was being perfected and their program confirmed by a great many people. Other than the actors and actresses, the theater was filled with silence, very unlike the noise of a disorderly stage at night. However, it was a meaningful disorder, commanded for the purpose of a single objective. Within that theater, there was a silent place, cut off from the voices and noises flying around. It was the manager's waiting room, a room for Henry Irving. The actress, said to be the most beautiful in London, sat down on the sofa and sighed loudly. There was also a gentleman covered in black and red. The gentleman spoke words of concern towards the unwell actor. Wait, what? Henrietta? So she is a girl. I knew it.
申し訳なくて僕は一層参ってしまうから大丈夫少し風邪気味なだけさ
その少しというのが不安だもしもまた舞台裏で倒れたりしたなら僕は同じことをせざるを得ない立場だ
まったくもう君は
The intimacy of the conversation. A conversation filled with consideration for each other, and yet it was different from the intimacy of lovers. There was a strange sense of distance. Maintaining a fixed distance from one another, and yet filled with intimacy and friendship.
迷惑だと言っておくよ、エイブラム。私は一人でも大丈夫なんだ。君こそ私が言う筋合いではないかもしれないけど、戯曲作りもありがたいけど、一人のファンとしてはブラム氏の新作を。いいかい？小説の新作を早く読みたいんだ。
前処するよ。今日の舞台を見守り終えてからね。
ああ、もう君はいっつもそれなんだから。
それくらいのわがままは許してくれたまえよ、ヘンリエッタ。心配性は僕のたちだ。
本当に君はいつまでも心配性なんだから。私はそんなものを感じたことはなかった。
Never felt what?
そうよね、メアリー。ええ、そうですとも。そうよ。そう。M、黒い男。何をも語ろうとしない仏頂面の男。彼との距離感が縮まることなんてない。そういう確信があった。例えばお茶をするだとか、例えば食事をするだとか、それに夕べのアーシェトみたいに演劇を楽しむだなんてありえない。そうよね、メアリー。ええ、そうですとも。ありえないわ。私は彼の生き餌であって、彼は私と契約を交わした人。それだけ。なのに、何？これ何？
No. How on earth had this happened? Mary looked down and thought about it. She'd come here 2 days in a row now. She was watching the same Shakespeare play as before. With this man. An indescribable sensation. It wasn't that this felt wrong or undesirable, but something strange filled her up from head to toe. Could it be love? The one thing she did recognize was a strong sense of tension. So much tension her body felt like shrinking. The VIP seats. What was she doing up there with this man and his dark, shallow expression?
2人であろうことかダイシアム劇場の貴賓席だなんて。
The Shikkoku Theatre in the western part of the West End, managed in part by actor Henry Irving, a theatre emerging as the most gorgeous of its day. The performances were well acclaimed and popular. It was said that upper class and foreign customers sent gifts and telegrams full of praise every day. Henry Irving was an object of desire for most girls in London. He was the star of the theatre. It's a she, isn't it? Only yesterday, she'd seen Angie miraculously obtain tickets for one of his Shakespeare performances. But surprisingly enough, she was already back here watching the same play again. She hadn't even imagined it, looking down on the stage from these high seats, watching him play Romeo. She hadn't even imagined it. M, of all people, had suddenly given her a ticket and brought her here before she could tell what was happening.
行くぞと無感情な声で告げられて、ついていった先がここだなんて。
The Lyceum Theatres. VIP seats.
なんであなたがここのチケットを持ってるの？しかもこんなすごい貴賓席の。
She spoke hesitantly. Because of how the boxes were made, she could speak quietly without anyone overhearing them. She never thought her knowledge of theatres would turn out to be useful someday. There were many things she'd never thought, but she felt so undeserving that her body shrunk from tension and that indescribable sensation. Silence. She could only hear the actor's voice from the stage. She'd gathered up her courage and whispered so that M could hear her, but there was no answer. There was no answer. There was no answer. Damn it. That was something she'd expected. However, Mary still looked down. She couldn't think of what else she should do. They'd come in here together, but the man had said that he only needed a single seat and tried to sit down by himself. A staff member had brought her a small chair used by the maids, so she sat in that and made herself as small as possible. She'd never thought of herself as upper class, but she was being treated like this man's servant. She was embarrassed at her inability to object to it. Her inability to say anything in this sudden situation. She was sure Charlie or Angie would have handled things differently. She was so embarrassed her face felt as if it was on fire. She was watching a wonderful play, but she felt horrible. He said. There wasn't an answer earlier, but he briefly spoke.
興味がある。
She ruminated on his words, interested in a love story by Shakespeare. Mary didn't think that was possible, and yet the fact was he'd come all the way here to see this play. He'd come all this way to see it, because he was interested. And yet, why? Why was he making the same cold face as usual? His face remained the same even as they approached the famous scene where Henry's Romeo Montague talked to Juliet in her balcony. M glared at the stage without a single change in expression. There was no change whatsoever in his face.
興味がある。本当に気になってしまう。疑問がどんどん胸の内で膨れ上がる。
His words and attitude were contradicting each other. He said he was interested, but his face and gaze showed no sign of that. That contradiction bothered her. Mary looked up slowly.
うつむいたまま視線を彼へと向けて彼の顔をよく観察する。
M's gaze looking down from above as usual. She wondered if he'd choose this seat because he wanted to look down on the stage. Chose, not choose. Carefully. Carefully. Mary observed him while trying not to let him notice. She gazed at his expression. It didn't seem any different from usual. The man never showed an expression she could read emotion from. Even when his mouth was in the shape of a smile, his face didn't convey the slightest emotion.
何もいつもと違うというほど常に合っているわけではないけど変わらないわよね。いつもと何も。
A high nose, white skin despite having no circulation problems, a face which had the hardness of a sculpture. Nothing had changed. It was the same as usual. At the very least, he didn't look interested in the stage, or the actors, or the actresses, or the story, or anything. Is this a cigarette or is that a sausage? Quietly, Mary carefully observed him. The same M as usual, a black man looking down at something with cold eyes. Those eyes moved slightly.
こちらを見る。そう、彼を盗み見ている私の顔。
舞台を見ろ。俺を見るな。
何の根拠があってそんな。あなたのことなんて見ていません。見てないわ。
俺を見るな。
見てないわ。
見るな。
見ていません。
見るな。
はい。
It was night by the time the curtain fell. M led Mary out of the theater. The same night-time scenery as yesterday, she again saw a lot of girls among the visitors heading to their gurneys or carriages waiting at the terminal. The gentlemen and ladies who seemed to know each other said their goodbyes and disappeared into their carriages and gurneys. It felt like a repeat of yesterday. Which was why it took Mary a moment to be surprised when she saw the gentleman with a red and a black cloak. She thought she was having delusions based on last night. She hurriedly greeted him, the gentleman with lovely grey facial hair, clad in black and red.
昨夜は彼の姿を連想したけれど、M とはあまり似ていない。優美な紳士、黒色と赤色の裏地のマントが目立つ。赤色、今夜もそう、視線が吸い寄せられる。
The grey beard and mustache hid his age. A man in a black cloak. Yeah, he looks probably older than he actually is. A soft demeanor unlike that of M. A kind voice unlike that of M.
驚きました。ミス・メアリー・クリスティ。今宵もおいでいただいていたとは。それほどまでにお気に召していただいたとは幸いです。シェイクスピアは若い方に受け入れられがたいとばかり。
ごきげんよう、ミスター。今夜も素敵な舞台をありがとうございます。シェイクスピアは、とても好きなんです。だから今夜も。
Lies. She didn't hate Shakespeare, but she hadn't come here of her own free will. There were many things she wanted to tell Mr. Bram about the play and the lead actor, but this man standing next to her, M, she couldn't talk about it with this unsociable man beside her. In fact, she wasn't even sure what to do. She didn't think Mr. Bram had noticed him yet. He might simply leave after saying one or two more things. But if M said something arrogant to him, she was so worried she couldn't think straight.
それで、こちらの紳士は？昨夜にはお目にかかりませんでしたね。はじめまして。ブラム・ストーカーです。お見知りおきいただければ幸いです。もしや、ご婚約者でいらっしゃる。
なんでそうなるんですか？
She makes that cute mouth again.
見た目、年齢、そうね、年齢からして、確かになんだかよくわからないから、年の離れた婚約者とか。
Her face is funny.
思っても不思議じゃないか。その。
おじだ。彼女はメイだ。今宵は進められるままに感激してみたが、素晴らしい舞台だった。見事なものだ。
これはご丁寧にありがとうございます。ミスター・クリスティ。
いや違う。クリスティ姓ではない。
なぜだろう。わからない。訂正することの意味なんてないのに。どうせ嘘なのに。彼は私の叔父なんかじゃない。父様に兄弟なんていないもの。その場しのぎの嘘。なのに静かに M はブラム氏へ名を告げた。
It wasn't just M, not a single letter of the alphabet, a human name rather than a suspicious code name. It was definitely a human name, an English name she hadn't heard before.
俺はジェームズ・モリアーティだ。
Yeah, of course, you are James Moriarty. Wait, does M stand for Moriarty?
ジェームズ・モリアーティ。そう、確かに。
No, that can't be. She'd never heard that name before. If M was an initial, it did match. Was it the bitten did? Was it his real name, or something he made up just now? She knew there was no point in asking, but she did anyway in the gurney. Is that your real name? There was no answer. There was no answer. There was no. Instead, he told her about a different matter.
朝の店に所用がある。お前はこのガニーで下宿へ戻れ。
Yes. Mary was riding in the gurney. She thought they'd go back via the underground as usual, but M hired a gurney. M got in the gurney too, even though he could have walked from the theater back to the Ritz. Would walking have been that troublesome? It still couldn't have been that far away. And yet M got in the gurney along with Mary. He told the driver to go to the area where Mary's lodging house was. He had an errand in Soho on the way. M briefly told her that.
私の質問へ答えるほどなく、そう言った。今さら驚かないし、不満にも思わないわ。ただ、ああそうと思うだけ。
Before long, the gurney stopped in Soho and M got out without Mary. He told her to keep her engine phone on at all times. She'd already been doing that. Instead of having to confirm the contract every week, Mary's new order was to keep her phone on and carry it with her everywhere. She told him she was already doing that, which made him look at her once. That was it.
以後は連絡を待て。今夜はご苦労だった。
いいえ。どう走った後の私には行ったことないのに、劇場へ連れて行った後にはそういうのね。
Mary said that and got out of the gurney.
何をしている？
双方からなら地下鉄で行けるの。もう降ります。
勝手にしろ。
His gaze had no emotion, but somehow she could understand what it meant. His eyes were those of someone looking at a fool and wondering what they were doing. Mary didn't care. She didn't care how he looked at her. She simply couldn't stand having him pay for the gurney the rest of the way home.
借りはなるべく作りたくなかった。ありがとうなんてあなたには言わない。そう私は決めたはず。おぼろげな黒い町の記憶の彼方でそう決めたと。
Mary got out of the gurney while hiding her anger. There were hardly any people in Soho in the middle of the night, so it was quiet. The underground station wasn't that close, but it wasn't far either. She turned her back to M and headed for the underground station. Mary decided to do that and began walking into Soho at night. Just as she did that, an energetic voice rang out on the quiet main street, and that voice was from someone she knew.
やっぱりメアリだ。なんだよ、双方には酒場なんかないぜ。ないぜ。久しぶり。なんだよ、元気みたいじゃんかよメアリ。生意気にガーニーなんか乗っちゃってさ。乗っちゃってさ。
薄暗い双方の表通りに見知った姿。小さな子供たち2人。
She immediately felt better. She'd been feeling bad after being in an enclosed space with M in the backseat of the gurney. She bent down to hug the two of them as they ran towards her. Then she decided it was a bad idea and stopped. She squinted carefully and dodged the two shadows rushing towards her. She slipped by them and spun around. There she saw the smiles of the children who ran past her.
やっぱりぶつかってきてた。危ないわ。もう少しで。
なんだよ、生意気だぜメアリー。メアリーのくせになんか動きが素早いなんて。お前本当にあのどんくさいメアリーか？
メアリか？残念でした。そう何度もズロース見られてたまりますか？
ちげえよ、お前がどんくさいからスカートまくってたな。こう危機感ってやつを教えてやってるだけ。マセガキ何？
相変わらずなんだから2人とも。ちゃんと元気にやっていた？ザックをあんまり困らせてあげないでね。
元気だぜ。稼ぎもまあぼちぼちってとこ。まあいろいろと稼ぎ先を見つけてるからな俺。すげえ旦那の下で働いてたりするんだぜ。するんだぜ。
相変わらずたくましそうね。安心したわ。ケインズ、アンディ。
She began to smile. Then she noticed she'd forgotten about M. He was still only a few feet away from her, and he had been watching the exchange silently. He should have just gone into the bookshop already. For some reason, he kept standing there without a word, gazing at the children. Mary wondered why and felt chills run down her spine. She couldn't predict what a cold-blooded man like M might do. He acted as though nothing in the world had any interest from him, and yet he said he was interested in that play. However, based on her usual impression, if he ever bumped into children playing, she worried. She worried he might want to kick them or something.
知り合いか。
そう、友達。昔ロンドンにいた頃に仲の良かった人と、この子たち付き合いがあって。
He doesn't really seem like the guy who would kick children.
友人か。なるほど、そうか。そこの子供たち、来い。
なんだ？なんかくれるのかよ、黒い旦那。あんたメアリーのなんだ？それ？くれるのか？
She looked onwards in shock. M gestured for the children to come to him. Then, once they did, he put a banknote in each of their hands. A pound note, a large sum of money.
うわ、すげえ大金！
レイダー、メアリが世話になっている。以後もよろしく頼む。
レイ？私が世話？どうしてそういうことになるの？
任せとけって。なんだよ、メアリ姉ちゃん金持ちの妾になったのか。そうならそうっていいよな。
言えよな。メアリったら本当に水臭いんだから。それならそうで言ってくれればお祝いいろいろ用意してあげたのに。
違います。
水臭いよな、本当に。妾になったらあれだよな。もうあんまりスカート下ろせねえな。
下ろせねえな。
違う、たまにぐらいしてやるから。旦那に捨てられないよう頑張れよな。
頑張れ。
違うって言うのに。
She couldn't effort to simply stand there stunned. Mary opened her mouth to deny it, but she was too late. The two children were already running off with smiles on their faces, probably to stash their money somewhere. She had no time to correct their misunderstanding. Once they ran into an alleyway, Mary could never catch up if they didn't want her to.
近いうちに捕まえて訂正と注意をしておかなくちゃ。彼から何かをもらうだなんて何か恐ろしいことをさせられかねない。でも少し意外に思えた。何一つわからない彼ではあるけれど、子供たちあんな風に突飛な行動すぎてそう表現できるかはわからないけれど、でも私はそう感じた。何もかもわからない黒い男 M。 あなた子供には
なんだ。なんだ。
あなた子供には少し優しいのね。優しいという表現は違うと思う。でも他には浮かんだ言葉がなくて、もちろん返答の類はなかった。
After the children left. What? M paid the toll gurney with a bank deposit transfer via his engine card. Shortly thereafter, M picked her up and put her in a different gurney. Mary didn't know what was happening.
怒ったの？私に子供好きと言われたから。もちろん何を言われることもなくて、一人でガーニーに乗せられて。
Mary was too surprised to say anything. She was placed in the back seat of a gurney, and the door was closed violently from the outside.
下宿に戻れ。
He said that, and she arrived still dumbfounded. She thanked the driver and stepped outside. Until now, whenever she'd gone home in a gurney, she tried not to get out directly in view of the front door. Mary was living off payments from her mother, so she couldn't travel in expensive gurneys very often. She only used them when going somewhere far away with Charlie and Angie. Until now, if they split in 3 ways, she could still manage. However, riding one alone was just. She couldn't let Mrs. Hudson notice. If she got suspicious and asked about it, there was a risk Mary would have to tell her about M. If she claimed she paid the gurney herself, Mrs. Hudson might start asking about how she was using her money, and in the end she might not be allowed to walk outside freely. And if she couldn't go outside at night, she couldn't fulfill her contract. Which was why she got out in a hurry, but Mrs. Hudson was already there waiting for her.
おかえりなさい、メアリー。
ただいま帰りました。ミセス・ハドソン。
そろそろ帰る頃よねと話していたの。そうしたらなんとぴったり。夕食は済ませてきたのでしょ。もしもまだならうちで食べていく？
Who's us?
私はもう食べてしまったのだけど、賑やかなのは大好きだから。あなたたちをあげるのも久しぶりだし。どうかしら、メアリー。お腹空いてる？
あれ？ミセス・ハドソン、なんだか妙にニコニコしている。まるで何か嬉しいことがあって浮かれているかのよう。ガーニーのこと、もしかして気づいてないのかしら。ごめんなさい、ミセス・ハドソン。もう済ませてしまっていて。
あら、そう。残念だわ。あ、でもそれなら3人でお酒でも。いえ、ダメね、ダメだね。お酒はあなたたちにはまだ少し早いわね。
Alcohol is not something you should appreciate.
成人したとは言っても、まだお酒の味を覚えてしまうには早いもの。残念だわ。
3人？そういえばあなたたちと言っていたような。私と他に誰？今はミセス・ハドソンと私だけ。他には誰も。ここにはいない。
That's certainly strange. What's she doing here? There were two huge chestnut-colored eyes. Angie. Angelica's face was there. On the other side of the door, she suddenly showed herself.
もう今日は予想外のことばかり。まさかアーシャがいるなんて。
もうメアリー、昨日2人で舞台見に行ったのに、まさか昨日の今日で誰かと夜までどこかへ行ってるなんて。もう不良、メアリーの不良。
アーシャ、声大きい。もうね、夜だから。
そうね、もう夜だものね。メアリーの素行についてはアーシャちゃん、明日の朝にでもたっぷり追求しておいてね。
はーい、ミセス・ハドソン。
明日の朝？
あら、2人で約束をしていたんじゃなくて？
してました。だよね、メアリー。今日はお泊まりの日。出ないとガーニーのこと言っちゃうぞ。ハドソンさん、まだ気づいてないけど。
She's quite the little devil, isn't she?
お泊まり。私はいいけれど、アーシャは本当にいいの？外泊の許し。
大丈夫だよ。ちゃんと言い訳しといたから兄貴も平気。
もう兄貴だなんて驚いてしまった。まさか泊まりに来ていただなんて。アーシャのお兄さんは特に厳しい人で、外泊なんてそうそう許してくれない。
We didn't see her brother yet, didn't we?
でもこの自信に満ちた笑顔、きっと何かうまくやったの。
メアリー、じゃあすぐにお風呂入ろう。お泊まり用に寝巻きを用意したの。着替えもタオルもちゃんと持ってきたの。
Oh, are you going to take a bath together?
え？お風呂？でもうちのは2人同時には。
Oh, come on, you two can cram in there somehow.
お風呂入ろう。ほらほら、早く。
アーシェ、ね、話を聞いて。うちの浴室はね。シャーリーの真似をしてみる。少し落ち着いたトーンの声を出して。ね、
入ろう。
真似